Welcome everyone to the SCPRSA breakfast this morning. We are live here in the upstate in Greenville, but are streaming this to our friends in Columbia and Charleston. For those of you who have questions, be sure to tweet them using the hashtag SCPRSA 2016. I would like to introduce our very exciting speaker for this morning. She was so great the first time that we asked her to come back for more. Please join me in welcoming Nika White, Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at the Greenville Chamber of Commerce, and her topic this morning is Engaging Diverse America 2.0. Thank you, Nika.
Thank you so very much. I'm thrilled to be here, and so I want to welcome the folks that are here live in Greenville at Jackson Marketing, but I also want to extend great greetings and welcome to those of you who are part of the live streaming that's taking place in Columbia and in Charleston. So again, I'm Nika White. I serve as Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion with the Greenville Chamber of Commerce, but as I shared with you during the initial visit, or you were kind enough to have me here to do 1.0, my background is very deeply rooted into the communications marketing field, and so I feel that I am in very familiar territory when I speak with you on this topic today that I'm extremely passionate about. But thank you so much for the invitation. So my objective for the next 40 minutes or so is to help each of us as marketing communications professionals, as PR practitioners, to think more intently about strategically allowing ourselves to be well-versed, to communicate effectively, to reach diverse audiences. And so we're going to talk about multicultural communications and how that fits into the world of the work that we do day in and day out. The opportunity and the trade-off for each of us is that at a higher level of intentionality that we will exercise, we will find that we're going to become more astute communicators. We're going to find that our messages are going to resonate better with broader, more diverse audiences, and it's going to make us more effective marketing partners for all of the constituents and clients and organizations that we serve. So we'll jump right in. I actually included this, but I recognize that in the introduction we're using a different hashtag this time. So last time when I was here we used SCPRSA diversity. My understanding is that today for all of your questions we're asking you to use SCPRSA 2016, and so please make note of that, 2016, and we will take questions towards the end. So just as a brief refresher, because I recognize there could be some individuals who may not have been with us when I did 1.0, I want to give you just a little bit of information on my background because it certainly helps to frame a lot of the conversations and the context of what I normally share when I do these talks. But my background certainly has shaped my perspective on diversity and inclusion. I view diversity and inclusion as a leadership function, and so if we serve in roles that are leading us to help to make change, to impact change, to be effective in our discipline, then we're leaders. We're all leaders. And I feel like in that regard, we should be concerned and we should leverage diversity and inclusion as much as we can for the opportunity that it presents. So my professional career spans about 18 years. I started my career working in marketing communications. The latter part of my tenure working in that role, I also served as diversity and inclusion manager for the agency in which I was employed. And during that time is where I really felt drawn to this space, which led to the opportunity to work full-time in the work of diversity and inclusion. But I'm still very much connected to the world of marketing communications. I have had the privilege of doing some consulting and training and speaking both nationally and internationally on this topic. And I feel that it's incredibly important, particularly for those who are in this industry. So typically, a lot of research around the topic of diversity and inclusion will find its way into my presentations. I'm a fourth-year doctorate student in management and organizational leadership, and I love data and I love information, and so that's going to come out today. Here's a list of just some of the clients that I've worked with, specifically around diversity and inclusion. And we're going to jump right in. But before we do, I want to revisit the focus of the main points that we addressed during the initial visit quite a number of months ago when we talked about engaging diverse America. And at that time, we were really laying the foundation. But here are the 4 points. We talked about valuing human difference and how when we talk about diversity and inclusion, in essence, really that's what we're attempting to do. It's just to value human difference and to do it in a very effective way so that we're seeing the opportunity of diversity and not so much seeing it as an obligation, which, again, that's part of what we addressed last time. We want to shift the paradigm from asking the question, what can the organization do to advance diversity and inclusion, to what can diversity and inclusion do to advance the organization. What's the opportunity there? We talked about practicing intentionality, and so today we're going to take that a step further. And I'm going to give you some applicable tips that you can start implementing into your practitioner right now as a PR professional as to how you can more effectively address, communicate, and resonate your messages with diverse constituents. And then fostering inclusion and belongingness. So what does that look like? You may recall the matrix where we talked about we want to be in that matrix where people feel included because they're valued, because they are being leveraged for the betterment of the organization. And so I think this is a natural progression for 2.0 because we're going to build upon these points. And again, I'm going to help you as PR professionals be able to understand how to best engage diverse America by leveraging communications to broader constituents. So the face of America is changing. It's changing very rapidly. We no longer live into this world where there's a lot of sameness. You know, we have so much diversity that exists right now, and the layers of diversity are really deep and rich. And so one of the things that's become very fascinating to me is just to watch the evolution of how the melting pot is really evolving. We are no longer going to be in a place relatively soon to where there's going to be racial majority, because really we have that broad scope of diversity that represents diverse America. So I share this because it demonstrates the need for public relations professionals to think more intently about strengthening multicultural communication practices. And to become more inclusion-minded communicators, one must understand that the criticality of effectively reaching diverse audiences as organizations function in a multicultural environment is that you have to be intentional. You have to make sure that you're recognizing that we do live in diverse America. And let me tell you what this looks like exactly. A lot of times people will say, I welcome diversity, I appreciate diversity, and I embrace diversity. And they're well-intended when they say that. But I always take a step back to treat that as a teachable moment to really say, what we're trying to communicate is that diversity is happening. We don't have to do anything to welcome diversity because it's happening. Growing in persons of color, you'll see on this slide that over the age of 70, 20% of people in color represent over 70. Under 10, 70%. That says something to us, actually says something very significant to us. 48% of the largest cities are predominantly minority. 80 million boomers are set to retire over the next 20 years. And then the last point here, 75% of new entrants to the workforce will be women and people of color. Again, just demonstrates we have that melting pot. To further demonstrate this point, the Hispanic population is scheduled to double from 15 to 30%, which is going to be 132.8 million by 2050. The African American population is projected to increase from 41.1 million to 65.7 million, also by the year of 2050. And then the Asian American population is expected to increase from 5.1 to 9.2 by 2050. 40% of millennials are multicultural. Again, the melting pot has begun, and we're seeing this influx of this boom of multicultural professionals, and many of them are in that early stage of young professionalism.
And would you say those millennials are no longer what we term as the up-and-coming college people? Obviously, by age, their economic impact.
They are business owners, they are entrepreneurs, they are individuals that are highly coveted by organizations that are looking for new talent that has been exposed to such a great level of technology and knowledge that, quite honestly, a lot of the baby boomers, they just don't have. And quite honestly, admittedly, a lot of the baby boomers will tell you they really don't have a whole lot of interest in getting caught up at the same level of those millennials. And so this is an important factor for all of us to be aware of. So I shared this graph last time, and I think it's so important that I wanted to share it again, because when we talk about diversity and inclusion, oftentimes we like to narrow it to race, gender, and age, but it's so much broader. And so you can see from this graph that we need to start being more sophisticated in the way in which we talk about diversity and inclusion. It's not just age, race, and gender, but so much broader. So multiple layers of diversity. So this brings us to engaging diverse America 2.0. And what I'm going to share today will hopefully be some tips, trends, and issues to be aware of as communication professionals really looking to have your messages resonate and to be effective marketing partners for your clients. So, multicultural communications. We're going to deal with what are the issues, what are the trends facing communicators as they strive to reach increasingly diverse audiences, both internally and externally. And I stress that because part of being an effective PR practitioner is not only how effective you are in partnering with your clients to reach their constituents, but it's also about how effective are you to interact with your peers and your colleagues on your team that also may have a different background than you or be a multicultural professional. It's no secret that there exists today a broad range of diverse cultures, races, faiths, nationalities than ever before. And this increasingly positive trend is set to continue as we've been talking about so far. So to stay ahead, we have to help our clients understand the opportunities and the potential risk in communicating with specific groups. So the first point that I want to share with you is a tip for, again, being more effective in communicating with multicultural audiences. And that is simply, you have to understand multiculturalism. There's no way around it. This is incredibly important. Understanding multiculturalism is to understand the proper way to respond to cultural diversity. Multiculturalism does not always mean Hispanic and African American. Sometimes we gravitate to those two demographics because, they're really large demographics, but we have to recognize that while these are large segments, they're also a really emerging aging population, as I just showed you, as well as pockets of Europeans, Middle Easterners, and Pacific Islanders. So we have to remember that. So what we want to do is to become more proactive in our approach to understanding multiculturalism and put the onus on ourselves because it makes us smarter, more effective marketing partners for our clients. During the research stages of any of your PR campaigns, you want to include ethnic segments and note the differences between those ethnic segments because you may find that you have to alter your message accordingly to make sure that you're properly delivering your message accordingly. You have to also develop cultural sensitivity. I'm going to talk a little bit later about being in the mode of where you're always extending grace, but you're always willing to accept grace, which means that you're willing to make mistakes and to allow those mistakes to create these teachable moments. But we have to be sensitive to the fact that we all are different. There's no longer really a right or a wrong, but it's a matter of just different. How do we allow that difference to not hinder what we are trying to accomplish, but rather to promote and help embrace and foster what we're trying to accomplish? It's going to be very important when you are learning to understand multiculturalism, to use universal analogies. We don't think about this sometimes when we're talking to a very broad, diverse audience. But if you use an analogy, make sure that it resonates across all cultures. And you may think to yourself, well, how can we do that? Because, there's so many different cultures. And is it really possible to find something that's universal? This is where you're going to have to do your homework. Now, I will tell you, there are some just generalities that I feel like every culture certainly can embrace and can understand. I'll give you some quick examples. Nearly everyone in the world can understand or identify with a traffic jam or with a lesson, a hard lesson, or something that you've been taught that really has resonated with you, or even being able to have the opportunity to enjoy something. What does that feel like? At different degrees and different levels, but you want to find something that's universal. The other thing you have to do when you are really practicing a great deal of understanding of multiculturalism is to check your assumptions at the door. We no longer can make assumptions because when we make assumptions, we are really saying that we have all of the knowledge and we have all of the insight to understand why someone has the perspective that they have, why they think the way that they do, and that can really lead to disaster, and it can lead to broken relationships, and it can lead to misinformation, and it's really misguiding to the people in which you're trying to communicate with, and so you have to check your assumptions at the door. Those things are, the cultural understanding that we have is not always universal, so we have to make sure that we're intentional about that. And then communicators must also embrace the social nuances of diverse cultural groups and look to members of those said groups in order to create more successful campaigns that can speak directly to the individuals who live in those communities rather than being potentially perceived as talking down to them. I remember I was very young in my career. I was working at Urban Pill and Advertise, and I was working on a financial account that actually had a large consumer base of Hispanics. And so we went into these markets. We were actually doing some visits of the different locations. And this was a market that was heavily penetrated with Latinos. And so I was talking to this Latina that was working in this particular retail location. And my colleague that was with me, she said, "Why are you yelling at her?" And I said, "What? I'm not yelling." She said, "You're talking loud. She doesn't speak English well, but she's not deaf." And so that's just an example of sometimes our own, we feel like we're adjusting accordingly, but if we're not sensitized to the fact of how our actions are coming across, then we could potentially offend someone. We could potentially cause someone to completely disengage in what you're talking about. And so we just have to be aware of that, of our actions, and understand that, and understand multiculturalism as we've been talking about. So the next topic, this is not going to be as a surprise, because whether you're talking to whatever types of audiences, you have to identify your audience. But I find that it's even more critical when you know that you're talking to a very broad-based, diverse audience, because you're going to have to make sure that, again, you're reaching a point to where you are using universal language. Every region is different, and so you have to hone in on the regions for the campaigns that you're working on, that you're focusing on, and analyze the demographics very specifically in that region. If there's a specific segment that you're interested in reaching, then identify the DMAs or the regions within the highest concentration of that population group and study them. Understand what the dynamics are within those populations and those regions. You and your organization must be willing to devote the time and the resources to understand and connect with your audience. That's extremely critical. This is why diverse teams are so significant. So remember at the beginning, I said that I'm going to give you tips that are not only going to help you address your craft in a more effective way with your external audiences that you're servicing, like your clients and then their consumers, but also internally. This is why diverse teams are important. In order to really get the full benefit of diverse team, you're going to have to understand multiculturalism, and you're going to have to rely on your teammates who have experiences that are different from yours to help you be able to reach those audiences very effectively. The more you learn about these specific communities you want to engage, the more specific and effective your communications and outreach strategies can be. So in short, to others with real-world experience, you need to speak to others with real-world experience in these communities, and don't be afraid to enlist them directly in your outreach efforts. I always say that the whole notion of build the building, the people will come, is no longer, not in this melting pot of a world. You have to really engage with these groups in a very effective way. People don't really care what you know until they know that you care. And that's extremely true. As a D&I practitioner, I can't tell you how often I have people to come to me wanting to pick my brain because they're looking to increase their level of diversity and engagement with diverse constituents. And it's very well intended, and I appreciate those conversations. But I also want to make sure that I'm taking that opportunity to share. It's not a one and done. You can't wait until you have the very specific opportunity of the message to deliver and then decide, let me find some ways to be able to reach this group, and then you go to market to that group, because they're thinking, I have not seen you, I have not heard from you, I don't know who you are, I don't know that you care. So spend time building those relationships way in advance of when you actually want to connect with those groups. Understand what their needs are. Invest before you request. This actually is a great segue because it brings me deliberately to this next point. You have to invest before you request. And request in this sense is just whether you want their attention, whether you want some type of action on their part. You have to invest in them, invest in their communities, invest in what they're interested in. Help them to understand why they should even be concerned with what you're trying to communicate. And that's important. So I'm elaborating on the previous point, but communicators must spend time attending community events, particularly of those populations and those groups that you really want to resonate with. You have to participate in related forums, both on and offline, and build trust among those community members to facilitate a more mutually beneficial relationship. In other words, reading the research of others usually isn't good enough. You have to make sure that you're present, and that you're present in a very consistent manner. No in and out. It's extremely important.
Could you give an example?
I will give a great example of that. So, and I shared this example last time, but I think it's very fitting. Actually, I have two different examples. The first example is that when we first established our Diversity and Inclusion Initiative at the Greenville Chamber about 4 years ago, we did so because we recognized there was a huge need and a huge opportunity. Well, prior to that time frame, it's not that we did not value diversity and inclusion as a chamber organization, but we operated very lean. You know, we're a nonprofit, 501c3, actually 501c6. But what occurred is that because we were operating very lean, we would have people on staff that may have been responsible for membership or for public policy or for some other topic, but not specifically diversity and inclusion. And then we would say, can you layer this onto your responsibilities and also give some attention to diversity and inclusion? Also give some attention to helping to foster the acceleration of minority business growth and development. And those individuals would do it, and they would do it to the best of their ability. However, when that's not your primary responsibility, you find that you do a lot of starting and stopping, starting and stopping. And when you do that, you send the unintended message that maybe you're not very sincere or authentic about operating in that space. And that's what happened. That's not what we were saying, but that's what was perceived from the minority audiences. And we became very irrelevant, to the point to where the starting and stopping, once we started back again, we noticed that we would have a reduction in the level of engagement. And so that's one prime example when I say that you have to be present and be present consistently and really invest in those communities. I will tell you that once we actually got to the point where we were able to hire someone, and again, I was a lucky beneficiary, but to be in that role where you were constantly every day thinking about diversity and inclusion, champion the work of reaching those diverse constituents, that is when we were able to really gain some traction and really gain the broader engagement and more consistent engagement of those underrepresented populations. Another example is that when we started our work to really reach in an effective way the needs of the Hispanic business community, because this market in Greenville, South Carolina specifically, is growing at a tremendous rate in terms of the Hispanic population. So we knew that we had to serve that audience in a very effective way. But we knew that also we were not going to be the ones to bring those individuals to the table. And so we built relationships with key Hispanic business leaders. And our ask of them through that relationship was, you help us, you see what we're doing, you see our efforts, you see that we're very sincere, and we're getting your help to facilitate what this forward plan looks like. Then they became willing to go and bring others from their community, other Hispanic business owners, to the chamber to engage with us. And through that, now we have a larger group of ambassadors that are helping to bring and helping us to connect with those constituents in a very effective way. They have the relationships, we don't. We're looking to build those relationships. Does that answer your question, Bobby? Yes. Great. Okay, so the next thing that I want to share is, again, the important thing here is invest before you request. Develop authentic relationships and maintain long-term perspective. Beware of the language dilemma. This is the next tip that I want to share with you. It's not just about translating, and I think that all of us have become very accustomed to the fact that we can't just translate. We have to make sure that we are thinking about the culturally relevant messaging that resonates with our audience, and particularly as it relates to the Hispanic audience. There's so many different language issues there that you have to be aware of. You can't just translate it strictly and then expect it to relate across the board in a very effective way. You have to avoid slang. We talked about universal language is really important because, you know, people need to be able to understand what you're trying to communicate. So slang words are unique to individual cultures, and they're not always interpreted correctly. So make sure that you are avoiding slang whenever you're dealing with very broad multicultural audiences. I think that it's very appropriate for people to get to the point where they do feel comfortable asking people to repeat themselves if you can't understand what they're saying. I think that sometimes people are discouraged from doing that because it sends the message that maybe your English is not very well. But the challenge is that we're here to communicate. And if we're not understanding or tracking, we're going to have to be able to communicate that in a way that's very respectful, but that allows the individual to then be able to alter how in which they're communicating so that you two are on the same page. So that's really important. And there's appropriate ways to do that. You can simply ask them to say it in a different manner. You know, can you rephrase your question? You know, can you repeat it once more for me again? And I think that people will appreciate that because what you're saying is, I really, truly want to engage with you and understand what you're trying to communicate. Simplify your message. You want to use less complex sentence structures and vocabulary when you're talking to very broad audiences, particularly multicultural audiences. Slow down your delivery and clearly articulate each word. I have to really think intentional about this because I speak very fast, especially when I'm passionate about something. I can flow. And what happens is that I lose people. And so I have become very cognizant of the speed in which I speak when I'm talking to very broad audiences. And I think that's a practice that really all of us should really get into the habit of. You know, I will also give you a tip as it relates to maybe internal or external, but if you're in a meeting and you have a lot of diverse constituents that you are in this meeting with, and you all are collaborating and you're co-creating these plans or these ideas and you're brainstorming, then providing some break time so that maybe someone whose native language is not English can take a rest from the concentration that's required. We don't realize that, but sometimes if that's not your native language, those individuals are sitting in that meeting and they're concentrating so hard to follow, to be able to contribute, and the rest of us are so unaware of what's going on. So simply just being aware, taking moments to make sure everyone is tracking with you, and to provide some break time is a very helpful tool. Avoid scheduling where you can presentations by non-native English speakers at the end of the day when fatigue may affect their English speaking abilities. And so we live in a world where we are constantly presenting and communicating, especially in this industry. If you have some individuals on your team that are presenting to your clients or different constituents, and English is not their native language, that you may want to, if you can, try to schedule that time frame, not at the end of the day, but maybe at the beginning of the day where they're really, really fresh. These are things that are just small tips that we don't think about, but they're really important. So be aware of the dilemma. I also will say, relevant to this topic or this tip, that leveraging visual symbols can be very helpful. I love infographics. I'm a really big fan of infographics. I'm quite a visual learner. But I find that when you're verbally communicating something and then you have a visual, like an infographic, that helps to show that pathway, people tend to track with you better. But again, you have to just make sure that you're cognizant to not include visuals that are not perceived as being universal or really well understood by large audiences. Recognize generational differences. We've talked about a lot of multiculturalism and the differences within the different cultures, but we have to also make sure that when we're presenting to very broad audiences, that we're very aware of the generational differences that could exist. You would not communicate to millennials in the same way that you would to baby boomers, right? You just would not do it. In fact, research shows that minorities outpace their counterparts with social media, but this doesn't mean at all that you will reach a 65-year-old Filipino on Twitter. You have to make sure that you are meeting your audience where they are and that you are taking into account the generational differences. And there's lots of data and resources that are available to us in this industry, in this field, around multicultural media consumption, generational differences and such. And so I would encourage you to leverage that as well. Leverage several different media. This is also important because the same way that I've been sharing, people like to receive information different ways. We have to be cognizant of that. Not every individual will want to go to a website. Some people prefer to communicate by email. Some prefer for you to pick up the phone. I notice that a lot of the Hispanic constituents that I speak with, I don't communicate with them very often by email. They prefer to pick up the phone. And so I have taken their cues, and now when I need to communicate with one of my Hispanic business leaders through the chamber, I will pick up the phone and I will call them. And they like that FaceTime. It's very relational, and I think that it creates a level of comfort and trust that can be really important when you're trying to communicate with those constituents. And so leverage different social media, but make sure that as you're leveraging different media in general, not social media, but just media in general, that the messaging is really consistent across each one of those items that you're using. So different cultures like to receive information. It's a trust factor that goes with that. And people from some cultures, they do not trust information that comes directly from a certain individual. So you have to be careful with that. It goes back to the example I gave with when we were looking to connect with the Hispanic business community. We formed relationships with a few key leaders in that community that already had their ear. You're finding that a lot of individuals, and I've seen this with the whole political climate that's going on right now, that a lot of the candidates, they're spending a lot of time going to neighborhood associations. And why? Because they're trying to really win over those neighborhood association leaders because they're the ones who have the trust of the people in that community. And it's the same thing when you talk about multiculturalism and being, a professional communicator or a PR practitioner. You want to make sure that you're leveraging where you can relationships to help strengthen your reach to larger audiences that you want to connect with. It's really important. I mentioned this earlier, and this is actually my last point, and then we'll stop and we'll take some questions. But I think this one is extremely important. I do a lot of training for diversity and inclusion, and one of the exercises we do is we pair people up, and it's called first response. And we have them to pick out a different demographic or a different statement. It could be men, it could be women, it could be young professionals, it could be senior citizens, it could be Hispanic population. And what the other person is to do as they are calling out those different demographics is to give their first uninhibited response. What comes to mind first? And so before we start, if you can imagine, everyone's really nervous. And so we have to make sure we have a safe environment. So we tell people, we want you to feel free to make mistakes. We want you to be uncensored. And it's through that exercise that real, true dialogue can take place because people are being transparent. And what we find is that, again, I said this during the emerging or engaging diverse audiences 1.0, that we all have internal records. It's not to say that's who we are, but we all have different conscious and unconscious biases sometimes that will creep up into a circumstance. And so we have to be willing to extend grace. And so we allow those individuals to make mistakes about their group, other groups, and even identifying some of the stereotypes that they have found themselves from at one point or another, maybe even unconsciously buying into. So we have to be bold. When someone does or says something that seems a little off kilter or wrong, then I think that it's really important to extend grace and give those individuals the benefit of the doubt. You can ask yourself, how else could I interpret these words or actions? Is this something that may be more related to the culture of this individual versus something that I need to take personal? So I think we always have to start with believing that people are coming from a place of positive intent and extend that grace. Remain cool and composed, even when you have made a mistake that results in embarrassment for you or the other individual. In most cases, they do not mean for you to feel embarrassed. They don't. And so, again, we have to extend grace and accept grace. If you cannot think of any positive interpretation of someone else's actions or words, then chances are you're missing something. And so the lack of resistance oftentimes is the lack of clarity. And so where resistance is often the lack of clarity. And so clarify with that person. Again, dig a little bit deeper. Ask them to further elaborate on their experience. And I think through that, the learning will take place. And then when you feel strong emotions about something that is said or done by someone who comes from a culturally different background than you do, clarify their meanings before you respond. That's extremely important. Clarify before you respond. So a lot of these are really simple tips that we could use whether or not we're talking to someone that's of the same cultural background or of different backgrounds. But the main point is be aware that we all are different, and be aware that it is part of our responsibility to make sure that we understand multiculturalism and we become culturally sensitive so that we can be more effective marketing partners for our clients and more effective PR practitioners. I'm going to pause there and I will take any questions. And again, although this slide says SCPRSA diversity, we want you to tweet your questions to SCPRSA 2016.
So my question, and if you could repeat the question as best as possible.
Sure.
If that's okay. The question is that I really enjoy the idea of extending grace. I think that's something that is hard to talk about in corporate settings because grace is such a evangelical conversation. But besides that, how can, when we're amongst this diverse coloring of America that's changing, and we see something that's not directly impacting us, but it's just unacceptable. How can we be a part of the positive movement to help maybe that situation is happening beside us, to step in and say, you know what, that's not right. How can we be a part of not the polarization, but a part of the positive movement to say, how can we have a better conversation?
Yeah.
And learning how to step in and interject in the most appropriate way.
So great question, and it was a lengthy question, so I'm going to try to paraphrase, and I hope I'll do it justice. But the question becomes, when we are not directly involved in something that we may witness that is perceived as inappropriate and not culturally sensitive to certain groups, how can we change the paradigm to where we use that as a teachable moment and we're effective in shifting from whatever could be perceived as negativity around that to more of a positive experience. Did I capture that pretty accurately? Okay. And I would say that, and this goes back to regardless of who you're talking to, what you are experiencing and who's involved in it, it just goes back to relationship building. I will tell you that I've had to have some really tough conversations with individuals. And some, have been around issues of inclusion, diversity, or the lack thereof, and some have just been some really insensitive and inappropriate comments or behaviors. And I think that if the relationship is there, it makes it so much easier to address the behavior, because you're not really talking to the person or addressing really them, you're talking really about the behavior, and we have to remember that. I always tell people that when you're in an organization and you're trying to create this very inclusive environment, you're not necessarily going to change the way a person feels. Sometimes you may be successful in doing that, but more importantly, what you're after is changing the behavior. And so if you are not comfortable on your own going to that person because maybe you don't have that relationship to say, I know that you probably had some positive intent, but this is how I perceive that it came across. And this is the impact to our team, our work environment, and our mission as a collective unit. And I wanted to share that with you. And so I think that we have to broach it. Oftentimes we will shy away from those situations and we won't broach it at all. And to me, that perpetuates the problem. So I always tell people you're going to have to do it. But it relies heavily on having that relationship and not making it so much about an attack on the person, but really on the behavior that you're really wanting to change.
All right, so I'm going to read a question.
Sure.
Okay, so this is from Miss Ashley down in the Midlands, and her question for Nika is tips on how to have a courageous conversation with colleagues who aren't being conscious about diversity. Very similar, but I like the idea of how to be courageous.
Oh, I love that word courageous, because that is exactly what it is. We have to have bold spirits when we are in an environment to where we're working with so many different individuals with different personalities, different cultural backgrounds, different experiences in general. And so honestly, sometimes it takes just doing it, and being very much aware of the spirit of conviction behind it. We want to make sure that we're doing it because we want to change the environment. We want to make sure that we are operating from a place of, again, positive intent, and we want others to feel very comfortable and accepted in that environment. And so when you come from it at that angle, it automatically puts people at a place to where they're willing to listen. And so I do think that the answer I gave before to the previous question very much relates to that. And sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable. I will tell you, one of the things that I first learned when I came into this role, a mentor said this to me. She said, you're not very effective if every so often you aren't making people feel a little uncomfortable. And I think that if you're going, again, I remember I mentioned before that I view diversity and inclusion as a leadership function. So if you view yourselves as a leader and you find yourself in a situation where you really feel the urge or compelled to address something of that nature, you're going to have that bold spirit and just do it. But know that your intent was positive, and then hopefully it will land on solid ground.
So I have one thing, a statement from Ms. Kelly Davis in the Midlands, and I'd like to ask a question based on it.
Okay.
She says, more tips, recognize generational differences, leverage different media, and extend grace. Question would be is, where have you seen really good job of organizations really embracing generational differences? Which is a tough thing with the retirement, the baby boomers moving out, the millennials coming up and learning the new way. Have you seen a good example of really bridging that gap?
One great example that I know many organizations subscribe to is the mentor system. They will find someone that is more seasoned in the industry, and they will very deliberately pair them with maybe a younger professional. But I think that the opportunity there is to not so much position it as you are here to learn from this seasoned professional, but equally important, this millennial or this younger professional that's just now entering into this industry also has a lot to contribute. I think that the way in which organizations will organize teams are being thought about more intently in terms of mixing up the differences among those individuals, so that there is a level of connectivity to the baby boomers and then the young millennials. I think it's something that we have to just continue to train organizations on. I do a lot of training specifically on the topic of generational differences, because there are four generations in the marketplace right now. And so I think that organizations, in order to help bridge that gap, they are very intentionally planning these sessions, bringing in subject matter experts to at least address the topic so people are aware. I find that awareness is the best advocate for trying to really address this body of work in an effective way. Some people don't know what they don't know, and so they just assume. Again, we can't go off of assumptions. They'll just assume that maybe someone feels a certain way or is reacting a certain way for reasons that may not be really the cause or the case.
Last question.
Okay. These are great
right.
questions, by the way.
So this is from Miss Ashley, and every time I say your last name, I butcher it, so I'll be very kind.
Dusenbury?
Yes, I say it really bad, so I apologize, Ashley. Her question is what are the best practices for someone who has good intentions in their focus on diversity, but they're not a good listener? I think
Ooh.
listener is a really key word here.
Yes, but they're not a good listener. Well, the easy answer is become a good listener. And I say that laughingly, but it's really true. This work is complex. It really, truly is. And it's going to grow in its complexity because, again, we are evolving to a more complex world where we have all of these different types of multiculturalism that exist. And so we have to put the onus on ourselves to help strengthen our active listening skills. It's not so much about waiting for your turn to just respond, but it's about listening to be able to really understand what is the root cause of this person's pain or this person's discomfort or this person's concern. And I always listen for feel words. When someone says, I'm concerned, or I'm worried, or I fear, or I regret, those are feel words, and that means something much deeper. And so if we're not listening very actively, then we're going to miss the opportunity to really dig deep to the root cause that can help us, address and have a solution much quicker. And so there are certainly lots of resources that can help people to become more active listeners, but it is something that you have to practice. It doesn't happen organically. It does not. You have to really practice it and make sure that we quiet our egos. And I say that very intentionally because oftentimes what we're doing is we're just waiting to make our point, which means our egos are festering up. We have to quiet our egos and be willing to really engage and hear the heart of what someone is saying. I truly believe that people are well-intended. I do. Maybe that's just the optimism in me, but I believe that people are well-intended. And if they're well-intended, we have to make sure that we are approaching our communication interaction with them as though they're coming from a place of positive intent. And if that is the case, our goal should be to seek to understand. Because at the end of the day, if they're understanding, that's where we have the opportunity to create change in behavior or in attitude. So we have to make sure that we're very, very intentional to learn how to actively listen.
Last question, and I'll just pose it to you.
Okay, sure.
Doing this work, which is, you would probably consider the good work, talking about diversity and inclusion, what gets you excited about this work every day? And maybe share that question if that's okay.
Sure. So the question is, as a D&I practitioner and doing this work for quite some time, what gets me excited about this work every day? Well, I want to end on a positive note. So I want to start with, just very briefly, what becomes frustrating? Because I think that this is an opportunity for all of us. What becomes frustrating is when the notion of the work of diversity and inclusion is to be owned by the D&I practitioner. And I always tell people that, again, D&I is a leadership function. So regardless of what industry, what title you have, if you consider yourself a leader, then being concerned about the work of diversity and inclusion and leveraging it to help you be a better professional in whatever industry that you're a part of should certainly be something that's top of mind. So that's one big frustration. What gets me excited is the opposite of that. It's when I'm not even in the room, I'm not even a part of the conversations, not even thought about, but then I see diversity and inclusion. Not so much a diversity, because again, I said diversity is happening regardless if we like it or not. There's no action behind it. But when I see inclusion happening in a very effective way, that gets me excited. And it could be just a small thing, as so much as a work group is collaborating and talking, then there's someone who's being very quiet, and then all of a sudden that brave soul says, Angela, you haven't said something in a while. What's your opinion about this? And I share that very simple example to say that while it can be very complex, we all can take small steps to do small things to really make a difference, to help really foster inclusion in a very effective way. So I challenge you all to do that.
All right, so last thing, stand right here.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to invite Ms. Sarah Moore to come on down real quick and give us a quick 2-minute pitch for Mercury Awards that are coming up.
Awesome.
She is the chair of this great event, so I'm going to let her step right on in and just stand
Hi,
right
Sarah.
beside Liz.
Hi, Nika. Thank you so much for
Thank
being with us
you.
today. As Bobby said, I am the chair of the Mercury Awards this year. They are coming up in about a month. They will be on April 28th here in Greenville at the Clemson One building downtown. This is, if you don't know, this is SCPRSA's premier networking event where we honor the work that our chapter has done over the past year, calendar year 2015. So it's a great night to come together, network with your peers across the state, celebrate the accomplishments that we had in 2015. Ticket information is now available on the SCPRSA website, so go ahead and check that out. We do have early bird pricing up until April 1st, so you definitely want to get in and get those tickets early. And we also do have sponsorship information on the website as well. It's going to be a great event. We're very excited about it and hope to see you all there.